So this is an example of anterior shoulder dislocation or anterior dislocation of the left shoulder. You need to look carefully once you see the anterior dislocation of the shoulder. You need to check if there is associated greater tuberosity fracture, or if there is any associated anterior glenoid labrum, anterior glenoid bony lesion. So there are no here any associated fractures in this anterior shoulder dislocation. Here is another example of anterior dislocation of the shoulder. No associated fracture of the greater trochanter. There is no anterior depression of the humerus. No associated fracture of the glenoid bone. Here is another example of anterior shoulder dislocation, but here associated with greater tuberosity fracture. That's why you should check for the associated fracture of the greater tuberosity, because once you see the anterior shoulder dislocation, you think that this is a spot diagnosis and forgot to check for any associated fractures. So here, this is a greater tuberosity fracture. Greater tuberosity fracture. Here's another example of greater tuberosity fracture. This patient has a history of anterior shoulder dislocation, which is treated. Here's another example of a patient who had a history of anterior shoulder dislocation, which is treated. No dislocation is seen here, but there is associated fracture of the anterior inferior glenoid bone, denoting bony Bankert lesion. Anterior bony Bankert lesion. And here's a depression of the posterior aspect of the humerus. As this is the axial view. So here, this is all anterior and this is posterior. Here is the acromion, and here is the coracoid process, acromion, the anterior aspect, the posterior aspect of humerus. Here is a depression on the posterior aspect of the humerus, denoting Hill-Sachs lesion. So this is associated lesion, a common associated lesion with the anterior shoulder dislocation. And here, this is the anterior bony Bankert lesion, a common association with anterior shoulder dislocation. So in anterior shoulder dislocation, there is anterior glenoid lesion. In anterior shoulder dislocation, there is anterior glenoid lesion and posterior humeral lesion. In anterior shoulder dislocation, there is anterior glenoid lesion and posterior humeral lesion. Just keep repeating this so you can, so you can revise it. Here's the example of posterior shoulder dislocation. So here's the humeral head dislocated posteriorly. So in posterior dislocation, there is posterior glenoid lesion. In posterior shoulder dislocation, there is posterior glenoid lesion and anteromedial humeral lesion. Okay, so here posterior shoulder dislocation. Posterior shoulder dislocation, anteromedial humeral lesion, anteromedial humeral lesion, anterior humeral head depression. Here is the anteromedial humeral head depression. Okay, anteromedial humeral head depression called reverse of Hill-Sachs lesion. It is the opposite of the Hill-Sachs lesion. It is the opposite of the Hill-Sachs lesion. Okay, so how can you remember this? Hill is posterior. Hill is posterior. So when the Hill is anteromedial, it is the reverse of Hill-Sachs lesion. Okay. However, Bankert is anterior lesion. Bankert is anterior lesion. When you see Bankert is a posterior lesion, it is a reverse of Bankert lesion. So this is a reverse of Bankert lesion or posterior Bankert lesion. Okay, so here there is a posterior shoulder dislocation. Okay, with anteromedial humeral head depression called reverse of Hill-Sachs lesion with posterior glenoid labral tear, as you can see here. This black thing is torn and separated from the glenoid. Yeah, this is the posterior glenoid labrum tear, which is called posterior Bankert. It's not bony because it's only of the glenoid labrum. It doesn't affect the bone. So this is posterior Bankert lesion or reverse of Bankert lesion. This patient has a history of posterior shoulder dislocation, and on CT scan, as you can see, there is a depression on the anteromedial aspect of the left humerus. So the Hill here is not posterior, it's anteromedial. So it is the reverse of Hill-Sachs lesion, or anterior humeral head depression or reverse of Hill-Sachs lesion. There is no other bony injury of the labrum. That's it. Here, this patient also has a history of posterior shoulder dislocation, which is treated now. There is a posterior glenoid labrum tear seen here, indicating Bankert lesion, but the Bankert here is not anterior. The Bankert should be anterior. So the Bankert, when you see the Bankert posteriorly, so it is reverse of Bankert lesion or posterior Bankert lesion. Actually now it's called posterior Bankert or anterior Bankert. No reverse, okay? So here there is a posterior Bankert lesion with anteromedial humeral head defect. Anteromedial humeral head defect, reverse of Hill-Sachs lesion, posterior labrum tear, posterior Bankert lesion, but there is no posterior shoulder dislocation here. It's treated now. Here's another example of fracture of the humeral of the right humeral neck. Fracture of the right humeral neck is seen here. That's it.